average Confederate soldier was a young man in his early 20s, unshaven, unkempt, gaunt, but tough for months of difficult living. The Confederate soldier's woolen hat and uniform was gray, ragged from either having been worn too long or having been handed down from a dead soldier. It was not uncommon for the uniforms to be ill-fitting, with sleeves either too short or too long, and to have buttons missing. While the Confederate soldier's appearance was often shabby, it was his spirit which led him to the charge.
I'll march away to the firing line and kill that Yankee soldier.
Soldiers would write letters telling about their experiences. Confederate soldier S.N. Duncan wrote, "If you forget me here, put me down, and sink down to the soldier's forgotten grave, there to be thought of no more. For thee I live, and for thee I enter the field of battle, for thine freedom and happiness do I suffer the rigors thereof." Duncan's passionate words exemplify how fragile their lives were. Whether or not he thought anyone else would see this letter is difficult to determine. However, it is certain that this letter of his created a memory of a Confederate soldier. Another example of how the soldiers preserved their memory is through memoirs. A man named William Andrew Fletcher wrote a memoir of his experiences during the war. He was in his 60s when he had it completed. It was printed up for his family, friends, and for his fellow veterans to read at the Old Soldiers' Home in Austin. Although it was not intended for the public, it was published and thus became an influential piece of history used by other writers. In 1950, the movie The Birth of the Nation was released. It was a silent film directed by D.W. Griffith. Dr. Melvin Stokes, a professor of film history at the University College in London, said in his review, "It changed the history of American cinema. It supposedly told the true story of how the White South had been defeated in the war, and during the subsequent Reconstruction era, has been oppressed by a powerful Republican politician attempting to force black rule and full social equality on the region." Birth of a Nation was also the birth of Civil War cinema in the United States. So how does this film portray the Confederates fighting the war? The film also birthed a whole new genre of stereotypes. To give the film credibility to the interpretation, the characters in the film had to be stock figures who represented the kind of society and interpretation of history that white audiences generally expected in this era of Jim Crow segregation. There's Silas Lynch, the mulatto lieutenant governor, Gus, the renegade Negro, and Mammy, the faithful servant. This is the extent to which such roles are subsequently developed in terms of motivation or nuanced characterization. Black reaction proved much stronger and understandably less accepting of the product that Griffith presented his audiences than he surely expected. In other words, black men are portrayed as embellistic rapists by white actors in blackface, and the KKK are depicted as heroes. This sets the standard for how the public is going to see the Confederacy, and this leads to further filmmakers to do the same. In 1939, the film Gone with the Wind had been adapted from Margaret Mitchell's best-selling novel. It opens with a glimpse of the popular conceptions of the antebellum South. Dr. Brian Wills, the director of the Civil War Center and professor of history at Kennesaw State University in Kennesaw, said, "There will never again be another Gone with the Wind, because there cannot be. The mixture of audience expectations and popular impressions about the period being portrayed, the world events that affected the mindset of the audience and filmmakers, the on-screen chemistry between Clark Gable and Vivien Leigh, and so on, combined to make the film one of a kind. Add to the mix the writing that pressed the norms of accepted screen utterances and the burning of Atlanta itself, and it is difficult to imagine that anyone could succeed in duplicating this." Audiences already have expectations for this film prior to viewing it because of what they saw in Birth of a Nation. Civil War filmmaking had taken a turn towards romanticism. In terms of racial composition, Gone with the Wind is cut from the same fabric of The Birth of a Nation, although with less emphasis on the renegade aspect of black people compared to Griffith's film. A connection can be seen to the Confederate letters that have been left behind with Gone with the Wind, because Andrew Fletcher's rebel private was a favorite of Mitchell's while she was writing her novel, influencing her to adapt parts of his story into the historic aspect of this film. With 24 years between The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, The stereotype of blacks has been, quote, happy darkies, and a singing happy mammy raising the children happily on the plantation, as Wills points out in his book Gone with the Glory. However, in 1989, Hollywood had attempted to break the quote plantation myth with a film titled Glory. Although the film depicted Robert Gould Shaw's all-black volunteer Union Army, they are also fighting the prejudices of the Confederates in the South. Once again, the idea of Confederates in the South as being racist comes alive once again. In the film, Colonel Shaw comes across as sympathetic and willing to intervene to prevent unnecessary cruelty. Ironically, this is not reflective of the real Colonel's attitude towards such matters. In a letter he once wrote, quote, one trouble, which I anticipated, has begun via complaints from outsiders of undue severity, but I shall continue to do what I know is right in that particular. I have treated them much more mildly than we did the men of the 2nd, quote. The 2nd are the Massachusetts White Regiment in which Shaw had once served previously. Civil War films in Hollywood are starting to drift away from major historical aspects to the war, leaving out key details for understanding. For example, in Glory, historian Jim Cullen notes that the film is missing one of the most extremely important historical events in the Civil War America, and that is the New York draft riots in July of 1863, which is later portrayed in Gangs of New York, which was produced in 2002. Such an example can infer that Hollywood is overstating their interpretation of Confederate soldiers. The reality is that not every man is fighting the war because of slavery and racism, but perhaps because soldiers felt like they, quote, considered it the imperative duty of every young man, quote, as John Dooley wrote in his war notes in 1862. Unfortunately, reasons like this for soldiers to enter the war have been left out of the film. In 1993, the film Gettysburg was written and directed by Ronald Maxwell. The film was adapted from the novel The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. The 4-hour film is broken up into 3 parts, coinciding with the 3 days of battle itself. In the combat films of the Civil War, the exploration of motivation on the political spectrum is neglected. Each of the films leaves out the reasons for why the character has chosen to enter the war to fight. Overlooked are the politics of the war, making the Civil War more a matter of personal conflict and crises. Also, thoughts on the blame for the war are left out a majority of the time. All of this is far from what is depicted in The Birth of a Nation. Slaves themselves and the abolitionists who sought to secure their freedom were given full blame. These combat films, as one reviewer wrote about Gettysburg, are equally absurd since they blame no one. The Confederates are referred to in dialogue as, quote, the enemy, but they are either ignored by narrative action or they are revealed to be honest good men fighting for some ethereal lost cause that is not explored by the film text. So what can be concluded of this? Is it that Hollywood does not care to stay true to facts? The majority of Hollywood producers are after one thing: money. They will produce what they think target audiences want to see. In 1915, The Birth of a Nation made roughly $10 million at the box office. To other Civil War filmmakers, that screamed potential profits, and they had hopes of achieving the same. Is Hollywood rewriting history as a result of this? In a way they are, and this is because people are so easy to believe everything they see in a historical movie, and as a result, Hollywood is shaping the memory of the Civil War through what audiences will believe. In this instance, the Confederates have few priorities: defending the Ku Klux Klan, fighting for slavery, and taking down anyone who gets in their way. Although we have proven this to be incorrect, people are more likely to sit down and watch a glorified version of history than they are going to sit down and read a scholarly historical research. Getting back to these images and including the memories real soldiers left behind will be the only way to allow people to understand the true meaning of who these men that were fighting were.
Alright, would you rather sit down to watch a historical movie or read a historical book?
Can I say neither?
Yes, you can.
Neither?
What do you think of when you think of a Confederate soldier?
Like a handlebar mustache and a gray suit.
Can you tell me one fact from the Civil War?
North
How do you know that?
history class.
Alright. What films have you seen involving the Civil War?
Lincoln.
What is it? What was it about?
Abraham Lincoln and his, the 13th Amendment.
Is that what you think of when you think of the Civil War?
I think of Abraham Lincoln and slavery, and all the different battlefields.
What does a Confederate
area.
soldier look like?
What does a Confederate soldier look like?
Yes.
Handlebar mustache with a gray uniform.
How do you know that they look like that?
Because I've read about it in the history books.
Do they have pictures in the history books?
They have illustrations.
Okay. What does a Confederate soldier look like?
I do think of the gray uniforms with the buttons that go up, and they've got the hats.
Okay. Would you rather sit down to watch a historical movie or read a historical book?
Movie.
What films have you seen involving the Civil War?
Oh. I don't think any.
But do you think your image of the Civil War is connected to any of the films that you may or may not have seen?
I mean, I'm sure it would be. Yeah.
Okay. What do you think of when you think of a Confederate soldier?
A guy wearing a gray uniform.
Old or young?
Young.
About what age would you say?
16 to 22.
What films have you seen involving the Civil War?
Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer.
What was it about?
Abraham Lincoln slaying vampires.
Would you rather sit down to watch a historical movie or read a historical book?
Neither, but if I had to choose, probably
Why is that?
because books are probably boring and take up too much time.
Can you tell me one fact from the war?
Yes. Do you want to know that fact?
Yes, please.
Abraham Lincoln was president during it
How do you know that?
because it says it all over the place.
Okay. What films have you seen involving the Civil War?
Glory.
Do you know what that's about?
Yes.
Can you tell me?
A group of black Confederate soldiers. No, they were Union soldiers. Okay, this is embarrassing. Who basically tried to prove their ability to fight, even though they weren't free men.
Would you rather? Can you tell me one fact from the war?
From the war.
The Civil War.
That the South had better generals, but the North had more money.
How do you know that?
History class.
Okay, that's it.
I'll place my knapsack on my back, my rifle on my shoulder. I'll march away to the firing